It's been about 7 years since I've been up to Canada. Last time I was here, I was in Nova Scotia, if you can believe that, in Halifax, which is one of Canada's oldest provinces in terms of population. And I got to see firsthand just how serious Canadians are taking the issue of aging society when it hits them straight on. And I wish that we would have some of that pragmatism across the United States, because we still think that we're a relatively young country. But I want to start with a story of how I got into this area of aging, because it happened 26 years ago now. I was a college student at American University in Washington, D.C. And like most people who get into the field of aging, they fall into it, literally. For me, it was with my grandparents. My grandma and grandfather had gone into long-term care, and I became absolutely transfixed by their experience, both the positive and the negative, because as we all know, there are lots of gaps in long-term care services. But it wasn't just the aging of my grandparents that caught my eye. I would drive from Washington, D.C., where I was at school, to Pittsburgh, my hometown. Have any of you ever been to Pittsburgh before? It's a beautiful place. Pittsburgh is about a 4-hour drive from D.C., and you go through this small town in central Pennsylvania to get there. You have to go through this town. It's called Breezewood. And every couple of weeks, couple of months, I drive through Breezewood, and every time I drove through there, I noticed the same thing. Men and women who looked a lot like my grandparents, working in fast food, pumping gas, cleaning restroom toilets. I couldn't figure out at the time what that was, but it was the tip of the spear of perhaps the greatest demographic transition our society will ever experience. And we're in the middle of it right now. It's also not limited to our two countries. It's not just a USA thing or a Canada thing. This is something that started in the Far East, in Japan. It has quickly migrated to Western Europe. It has gone into places like South Korea, and it is hitting countries like Russia and China at a pace never seen before. Let me tell you a bit about what we do. We help companies and governments see the future. And our clients range from Fortune 500s down to small nonprofits and academic institutions. We actually advise the US government in particular on what they call strategic foresight, the community of foresight, which you may have heard of before. It's a group of agencies and some private sector organizations that have come together to assess what the future looks like for the United States. Guess what the number one threat is outside of climate? Demographic change. Because it is a structural force that's coming so fast and so furious, it's also something we've largely ignored for most of our lifetimes. We take large amounts of demographic data, and thank God, CanStat, USA Stats are able to pull together these data for us. They're trustworthy services. And we can take this data and look at it across the board, lining it up with birth rates, death rates, immigration rates, labor force participation rates. And when we take a look at the whole picture, we can get an idea of what the future might look like. We're lucky to have that because we know how long it takes for a baby born today to turn into an adult. At least 16 years. Some of you who are parents probably would argue it's upwards of 40 years. It takes a long time to make a child into a fully functioning adult. So we know today that our labor force will be much smaller in 20 years than it is even today. Then we take emerging tastes, trends, and technologies. We look at geopolitical power and how all of these things interact on businesses. And then we take historical and best-in-class examples because, as the famous American author Mark Twain once said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. So we look back to the past to find these patterns that may have occurred before and apply them to this novel period. The first time in human history where at least 1 out of 5 people will be over the age of 65. And in just a few years in Canada and the US, the number of people over 65 will actually outnumber the number of people under 18 for the first time in history. So, today we're going to learn a few things. I know we're going to take questions at the end, but if there's something super pressing you have to ask for clarity, raise your hand. I'm not embarrassed to stop and give you some extra insight. The first thing is we're going to understand how demographic change is a structural force, how it's impacting the labor market, and in particular, the workplace. That's the focus of our conversation today. However, as Pat alluded, every single piece of demographic change runs into societal change, economic change, political change, and even change within the education system. It will obviously pressure, as was alluded to, us to rethink the way our communities are designed as well, because we have to think differently about this new reality, this new population distribution. I hope you'll learn how to leverage this change to your benefit, because if you don't, the peril is just as equally distributed as the promise. Meaning that if we don't make change, the wheels come off the bus very quickly. And I mean very quickly. Pensions will dry up, healthcare systems will dry up, social welfare in general, done. There will be huge drags on the economy, and young people who are already paying 2 to 1 for retirees will be down to 1 to 1. Which will further cause the birth rate to collapse because no one can afford to have children anymore. The last piece we'll talk about, just in some anecdotes at the end, are what best-in-class employers and governments are doing to maximize this new reality. Because there's a number of different levers that you can pull, including engaging older workers. Now, top line, what is happening? Yes? If you do it right, but nobody's doing it right.
Who's not doing it right? The companies that won't allow pension funds to be governed outside.
I will take questions, but I'm not going to get into debate right now. But I appreciate that. So we're seeing lower birth rates first and foremost. If a nation wants to maintain its population, it has to have at least 2.1 babies per woman. Everywhere around the world, birth rates are declining. Doesn't matter where you are. Does anyone want to guess where the lowest birth rate is? Do you know it? South Korea. South Korea has the lowest birth rate in the world at 0.78 babies per woman. That's meaning less than 1 baby per household. Pretty astonishing. Anyone want to guess the highest birth rate in the world? No, Turkey is actually remarkably low. India just dropped below replacement rate. They're less than 2.1 now. Niger in Africa. Lesser developed countries, places that are following kind of a traditional family structure, quote unquote traditional family structure, traditional social structure, they have relatively high birth rates. Women on average in Niger have 6.78 babies. Ladies! That's a lot of kids. But they also have a high mortality rate too. So those kids aren't necessarily surviving into adulthood. In developed countries like ours, for the most part, there's a 95% chance children will survive into adulthood. We're not doing so great in the States right now on that. Not so great at all. And this is one of the things that can come apart when social welfare systems start to slip. We're also seeing increased longevity on average. At the end, fewer kids and a lot more older adults. In fact, in the States, I think it's next year we hit what we call peak 65. Peak 65 means we will have the largest number of people over the age of 65 at any point in history, and perhaps at any point in the future, because our birth rates are so low. In fact, there were 76 million baby boomers born in the States. There's about 69 million still there. Gen Z is about 69 million. The millennials are 72 million. Gen Z, 69 million, dropped again. And Gen Alpha is going to be a lot smaller. Now, of course, I had to dig into some Canadian data. Of course, can't be about America all the time, can it? It's a joke. What we see is a long-term trend line here in terms of the percentage of older adults across the country of Canada, going from about 12% in 2000 to 18% last year in 2022. That's a pretty steep climb for an industrialized nation. You will hit super age, as we call it, that point where 1 out of 5 people is over the age of 65 in just a few years, certainly by the end of this decade. So it is coming fast and furious. We're able to show some parallels between our countries because we roughly have the similar demographic profile. Yes? I certainly have. Immigration policies are one of the ways that you can take some pressure off of this to lower the average age of the population, but it's like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, because it only takes one generation for immigrant families to adjust to the natural kind of state of a country, so their birth rates drop too. So you're only putting kind of a quick fix on a long-term solution. And here's why. Because this is a global phenomenon, because this isn't just happening in Canada, we can only pull immigrants for so long. Okay? But immigrants are one of the ways that you solve some of the challenges right now, at least in terms of continuing long-term growth. That obviously brings with it its own challenges, its own political pushback. But what I want you to pay attention to, and this map comes from CanStat, amazing organization, does some great data visualizations, is when you take a look at this map, the areas with the darkest population have the highest percentage of people over the age of 65. And while most of Canada's population lives along the southern border, the areas with the darkest population have the highest concentration of individuals over the age of 65. They are all in rural areas. They are all in rural areas. That is the same in the United States. So the pressures that we're experiencing in rural areas are much different than those that are happening in the big cities. I live in Washington, D.C. Only 12% of our population is over the age of 65. That's about 4 percentage points lower than the national average. But if I go to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, 36%. I go to some states in the Midwest, it pushes up to 40%. There's one county in Florida, of course, it's home to the Villages, a very large retirement community, where it's over 50%. It's just not sustainable. So what happens is not just population aging in these places, but you also get into a period of depopulation as well. Now, I want to point out a couple more stats from StatCan just because I think they're fascinating, because it shows the inverse relationship of populations. The growth of the green line shows the growth of the 65 plus, while the growth of the purple line shows the growth of 0 to 14s. So you can see how this gap just opens up. It just opens up, and it continues to open up for the foreseeable future all the way into the 2050s. There are obviously countries that are being hit harder by demographic change than us. They can offer us a window into what the future might look like if we take proactive action. They can also offer us a window into what happens when we don't do anything at all. Last year alone, China lost, based on their own statistics, and we believe their statistics are off, especially on population counts, by up to 5 to 10 times. They lost a population, based on official statistics, 850,000 people. Now, let me put that in perspective for you. That's the city of San Francisco. Boom, off the map. And that happened in 1 year in China. What we know about population decline is there's a multiplier effect to it, just like there is with population growth. Japan has been losing since 2014 3.1 million people. They are the oldest society in the world now, with about 30% of their population over the age of 65. It is so dramatic in Japan that they've actually decided that 65 isn't old anymore. They just bumped that number up to 75 in some provinces. That's one solution. But nowhere is it more dire in the world than in Russia. Russia, since 1992, has experienced a loss of 4.1 million people. That's attributed to low birth rate. It's attributed to outward migration. It's attributed to the war in Ukraine. It's attributed to just general economic malaise. Russia has not managed this well. Russia also has incredibly low life expectancy among men. Life expectancy among men in a country like Russia is like 63 now, I believe. Can you imagine that? Yeah, can you imagine that? 63. In the West, in countries like ours, that pushes north of 70, 76 for men at birth. In Canada, I believe, 80 plus for women. These numbers are staggering, and they offer us a window into the future if we don't start preparing now. It is to scare you a bit. You should be scared, because every single system that we have, every single system that we've built over the course of the past century in the post-World War period is predicated on growth. More babies, more workers, more consumers, economy grows. Every single system is predicated on that. But we have to use history as a guide when we look at the future. So I think about what this current model looks like, where we have fewer children, many more older adults. It looks a lot like the post-war period. Now, some of you may chuckle at that. How could that look the same? Well, from about 1914 to 1945, our countries went through a significant demographic disruption. We went through 2 world wars, a Great Depression, and a pandemic. Birth rates collapsed during this period. That created a really unique relationship between the worker and the employer in the post-war period. A very unique relationship because there wasn't enough labor to go around. In 1950 in the United States, the stats are not too dissimilar here, 1 out of 2 men over the age of 65 was in the formal labor market. However, by 1990 in the States, that had dropped to 1 out of 8, despite a huge explosion of older adults, that had dropped to 1 out of 8. Now that window is closing because we are under incredible demographic pressure, incredible labor market pressure, because we only look at 16 to 64s as people who can work. That group of people is shrinking, certainly growing at a much slower rate. So if you take a look just about any country right now, you're seeing the relationship between employer and employees starting to change. We were talking about this negotiation on flexible work and work from home before we started the conversation tonight. 2 years ago, about 3 years ago now, at the early days of the pandemic, our group predicted that all we were walking into at this point was a negotiation on the days that we would go into the office. We predicted 3 years ago now that we were only negotiating to a 4-day work week. Well, guess what? Jamie Dimon this week says the near future will be a 3.5-day work week for most workers. Now, this, of course, is office workers. This isn't necessarily frontline staff. This isn't necessarily people who are working in service or in factories, but the relationship is changing for many of us that are in the room. We're also seeing, because of these pressures, they're not just demographic pressures, they're economic pressures, some changes in housing, family, and community structure. One of the big things that we're watching right now is the growth of the multi-generational household, or the return to the multi-generational household. It is now a trend. Oddly enough, there's a secondary trend. We're seeing a growth in single households too, because people can't earn enough or don't earn enough or don't want to get married and have children. That's growing at the same time. So we've seen over the past 40 years now, the slow, steady contraction of the nuclear family, which was the mid-century model. And we're moving into something altogether unique, but also something altogether old at the same time. The workforce, though, is what we're primarily here to talk about today, so we'll start with that. We are right now in the middle of this gap, this record gap between 15 to 24s And 55 to 64 is this gap that's showing up in the workplace right now. That is part of the reason why you're hearing these terms, quiet quitting, great resignation. That's what, in large part, why things like the UAW auto strike is happening. 75,000 healthcare workers just walked out of Kaiser Permanente this week. The Hollywood writers got the deal they want. The Hollywood actors are probably not too far behind. We have really big wage inequity. We also have a new dynamic in terms of labor realities where businesses have to negotiate with their workers more than they want to. If we do nothing, which is the current state of things, we'll see a drag on the economy. 65 plus labor force participation and employment rates have not kept pace with that population's growth. So even though we're seeing more older workers return to the workplace or stay in the workplace, there are a lot of barriers that are keeping them out. That could be ageism, that could be a forced redundancy, that could be not keeping up with skills, that could be just choosing to go into retirement. There are a lot of reasons why this happens, but it has not kept pace. The labor force participation and employment rates are also lower than working age individuals, yet they make up a higher percentage. And all in all, these factors do create a drag on the economy. Too few in, too many out means that the economy starts to slow. We're paying more to keep people out of work than to keep people in work. And that's problematic for long-term national prospects. And you may say, okay, well, this is a lot of numbers, a lot of data, a lot of thinking going into this. If you have a drag that's big enough on your economy, which this could in fact create, it can actually pull back a country's credit rating. Well, what do we use credit for? Well, we all use credit. Every country uses credit. What do we use credit for? We use it to build bridges, roads, factories, transportation networks, all of these things we use money for, hospitals. If we're unable to keep a high credit rating, we can't borrow at a good and favorable rate to do this kind of work, to keep the infrastructure needed to keep our countries healthy, safe, and secure, and economically prosperous. It is a slippery slope. I brought the US labor numbers today because I think they're quite striking. 16 to 64s in the next 10 years will only grow by 2.31% in terms of the labor market. Yet 65 plus will grow by nearly a quarter. Here's the scary number. 16 to 24s, which are that kindling to the economy. I see some of the students back here, the kindling to the economy. The people that are going into these entry-level jobs, they're going to drop by 7.5% in the United States. That's a big dip. Workers over 75, though, will grow by nearly 100%. Over 75 will grow by nearly 100%. And that is transformative. So I wanted to put this question in, but Ginger got to it already. How many generations do we have into the workforce? Well, we have 5 generations in the workforce. This is a first for us. It's a new period. It's something that we're working to figure out through new strategies and new interventions. But what's the one thing they all want? Too often we think about things like generational conflict. We don't get along, they took too much, they're in my way, they're in the ladder, that young person doesn't know what they're doing. What's the one thing we all want in the workplace? Flexibility? Bingo. Flexibility. That is the one thing every generation wants in the workplace, following, of course, a good salary. But also everybody wants purpose. They want to feel like they're contributing to something. And our math may change on what we want out of the workforce depending at what stage we are in our lives. A young person might want to work 80 hours a week, climb that ladder as fast as possible. A new mother might not want that, or a new father might not want that. They might want more flexibility, some more time to spend with their children. Older adults, it depends. But we don't know until we ask. We don't know until we treat people like individuals rather than as a stereotyped whole. The 5 generations at work roughly break out like this, with millennials being the largest generation in the workforce today. They will remain the largest generation in the workforce until they begin retiring. And that's not until about 20 or so years from now when they start exiting, if they exit at that traditional age of 65. I tell you, you talk to a millennial anywhere, they don't see 65 as a reality for them. They just don't see 65 as a reality to them. Gen X doesn't feel that way either. They just don't see it as possible. And Gen Z, which is of course coming in relatively quickly now, about 2 million each year, they still have this aspirational goal of retirement, but I think in the back of their heads they're saying, oh, probably not. Probably not. What we know about generations is that they build diversity in the workforce, and it's good for business. It builds stronger organizations at the end of the day. We got to talking just before we started today, and I think what's fascinating is that despite us knowing that this is something that's good for business, you can improve organizational productivity, success, resilience across the board by upwards of 30%. If you really have a good DEI practice in place, especially a good practice that focuses on inclusion, there's only 8% of companies worldwide that are actually doing anything around age inclusion. So they talk the talk, but they're not necessarily walking the walk. And this is one of the items that I would say to challenge you today to bring into the community, to think about in your daily lives is, how do we start making change around this issue in particular? How can we really start moving the needle? Because generational inclusion is one of those things that are going to carry our companies forward, carry our economy forward, and build not only greater resilience within these organizations, but also greater resilience within our nations. Older adults do a couple of different things in the workplace. Not only do they provide years of experience, which is essential for any successful operation, but they also have this unique effect of creating spillover. And spillover happens because of experience. Spillover happens when a young gun, there's a couple of you in the room, come in and say, I've got this great idea. It's going to change the world. And the older adult may say, you know, we tried that 20 years ago. Now, immediately you can see that conflict there. How do you solve for that conflict? What did you do 20 years ago? What's different now? How can we use what you learned to make this work today? How can we test that out to avoid those mistakes and actually meet the moment? That's how spillover effect occurs. That's how you get the most out of generational engagements. Now, we know that inclusive organizations look at things like flexibility, but a growing cohort of organizations are doing caregiving leave now. That's a big one. I can't say it's ubiquitous now, but it's certainly growing more and more each day. Perimenopausal support isn't just a buzzword, it is becoming essential to corporate operations. It is nearly universal in big companies in the UK now. The United Kingdom is the fastest adopting country in the world on menopausal related issues in the workplace, because they identified the loss of women 45 to 65 as one of the greatest economic threats to the country. Just last year, about 4% of big companies in America, in the United States, had perimenopausal supports. It's now 15%. So it's happening very fast, because when people leave in midlife, they don't often get to come back. And we hear these stories all the time. People who are made redundant, they retired early, they didn't like the job, they step out. I've heard 2 of these stories in the past 2 weeks alone. People who have left because of redundancy, they try to get back in, and the door is slammed shut in their face. People are also looking for lifelong learning and mutual mentorship. Okay, we're in a period of a tight labor market, right? We've also just coming out of a period of a labor glut. When the boomers entered the workforce in 1964, roughly, we got to see 76 million people come into the workforce in 20 years. That was cheap, readily available labor. At the same time, the global population more than doubled. There were cheap workers everywhere. That is changing very quickly. So a lot of businesses are starting to move away now. The real big leaders here are starting to move away from this idea that workers are disposable, and they're starting to look at workers like assets. What do you do with your assets? You invest in them. What do you do with your top producing machines? You make sure that they're always working, they're always up to date. What do you do with your physical plant? Make sure that it always has the best technology in it. We're starting to see businesses do this with their workers. But it isn't just on businesses to do this. It's on the individual, it's also on the state. It is the responsibility of all social partners to really come together on this. We're also seeing a growth of what used to always be there, going back to history, mutual mentorship. Young and old, working side by side within the same working environment, sharing their knowledge, sharing their expertise, and creating a better product or service, whether it's in the public sector or the private sector. And I have seen mutual mentorship work in organizations of 8 people. I've seen it work in organizations of 8,000 people. It can work if it's done right. One of my favorites, though, was a small carpentry in Germany. And this guy was 82 years old, shows up at the front door of this carpentry and knocks on the door, and he says, "Do you have any work for an old carpenter?" Okay, they said, "We'll give you a try." This guy was a master carpenter. You know what they did? They put him with an 18-year-old. This guy learned all of these new skills on all of the new technologies that they were using in mastercraft woodworking. Guess what the kid learned? All of the old techniques. So they were able to have that spillover effect of knowledge in real time, improving the overall operations and product of the company. We also want inclusive work environments. Every single one of us wants an inclusive work environment, but what does that look like? Well, it can be everything from your benefits package that is offered by your company to the way the space is laid out. It turns out that space has a pretty big influence on how we like our jobs, how we engage our jobs. It also turns out that our regulatory standards, whether it's the US, Canada, or our friends in Europe, are outdated, grossly outdated. They're focused exclusively on accessibility, which is something we should always try for, but they often leave other disabilities behind, the disabilities that we don't see, the disabilities that might come with a long life. I didn't have these 10 years ago. These are only getting worse. I'm sure I'll lose my hearing, that's in my family as well. These are things that we need to account for in the workplace if we're really gonna make them as friendly as possible for people. But it's not just in the workplace. It has to be how people get to work too. Transportation systems, community development, but also an area that we haven't really done a good job of exploring yet, largely because it's an industry driven by 20 and 30 somethings, is tech, especially around remote work. Are these systems that we're engaging with, whether it be Zoom or Teams, are they really set up to maximize the outputs of workers? And are they really friendly? Inclusive organizations also zero in on communications, because guess what? That's the one place that things fall apart first. 18-year-olds, social media. They're natives in social media. They grew up in it, they live in it. They're constantly bombarded with social media. Older adults, boomers, they didn't necessarily grow up in social media. So finding that parallel space where we can come together and share ideas, but also hold ourselves accountable is essential for managers. A very good friend of mine, a fellow author and a journalist for Yahoo News, got her big job at Yahoo when she was 65 years old. She's a badass. First 6 months of the job, she said to me every day, "Brad, my millennial," in parentheses, my millennial boss doesn't respond to email. She refuses to respond to email. I pitch her on a regular basis. I can't get anything back from her. What do you think is wrong? I don't know if I can stay in this job. Is she using another channel, was my first question. Well, we have Slack. The second she used Slack, their relationship went from 0 to hero. Now, that should be on the manager to communicate that. But if you're having those issues with your boss, regardless of your age, if there's a generational hiccup there, you should look at communication as possibly being that place that could be fixed first. And of course, we're seeing organizations, the big ones, grabbing onto this first, everything from PwC to Nike to Adobe. But the list goes on and on. We're also seeing a changing nature of work. And this is something that is often left out of the national discourse, outside of a passing conversation, in large part because we don't do a great job capturing data on this. We are wonderful with the traditional workforce in terms of capturing data, but flex work, gig work, and even entrepreneurism to a degree is not well captured. Entrepreneurism is also funny too, because it depends on where you sit in the world, and to some degree, your generation, in terms of how you refer to this. We find consistently that older adults refer to entrepreneurism as just starting a small business. Yet younger people always refer to it as being an entrepreneur. So even when we're collecting data, we have to make sure that we're getting the right language in place. Gig work presents a great amount of opportunity, but it also presents some threats. The biggest threat being that if you're doing gig work, you're responsible for getting your own taxes paid. You're also responsible for managing a schedule. You're also responsible for all of these various and sundry expenses that might not be spelled out up front. Flexible work, though, is probably the most promising right now for our long-term sustainability because it allows people to stay within the current framework of work, which is understood by everyone. And it also allows people to do things like job sharing, whether they be two older adults working together, somebody who's a new mother, somebody who might just be coming into the workforce and might want to get upskilled pretty quickly, having a hard time leaving the nest, perhaps. We will see this becoming more normalized in the future. Flexible work, though, flexible work has been tried time and time again. We tend to step back when the economy gets bad. Because when the economy gets bad, the first people to go have historically been older workers. So as long as the economy remains strong, as long as the labor market remains tight, we'll see more and more companies offering flexible work in the future. But believe it or not, 54% of entrepreneurs are now over 50. That is a US number. But I will say this, that this is consistent worldwide. This is pretty consistent worldwide. In fact, I am leaving for Seoul, Korea in just a few months to give a keynote there. And I did an interview with their paper, the Chosun, which is like the Toronto Sun or the New York Times. It's a national paper of record. And they said, well, Brad, I mean, just older workers, they're too feeble to work. First of all, wow. Okay, ageist much? I forgave it because of translation, but I knew what they meant. There was this underlying bias in place that just because people were older, they were not either able or wanting to work. Guess what? The Korean Ministry for Labor surveyed older workers, people over the age of 65. 72%, nearly 3/4, wanted to work past retirement. So this is not a supply side issue here. This is a demand side issue here. So it's really on employers to figure out how do they tap into this new group of people, this new group of workers that is currently sitting idly by. To step back for just a moment, our countries are in a really interesting position and one they haven't been in really since the post-war period. But this is a period that doesn't necessarily go away. We're not expecting a baby boom anytime soon. All the long-term data suggests that this is going to be a constant trend. Birth rates will continue to decline. There are really 3 levers right now, people levers, that businesses can pull right now and governments can pull to change the labor market. The first we mentioned was immigration. Thank you for that. The second is lowering the eligibility age of employee. What do I mean by that? Dropping below 16. 2 American states have dropped it down to 14. Iowa and Arkansas. Now, these are mostly rural states. These are kids working part-time on the farm for the most part, but it is a slippery slope, or it has the potential to be a slippery slope. And in fact, in our meatpacking industry in particular, there's a number of OSHA violations in place right now of children as young as 12 working illegally in these factories. My grandfather was in the mines at 14 in 1928. Are we really comfortable going back to that? So we've got immigration, we've got child labor. And then we have this whole group of people, literally tens of millions of people, sitting idly by with decades of experience, incredible knowledge, and incredible capacity, going for jobs and hearing, "You're overqualified." Most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. I had a boss who did this to an applicant a few years ago. Guy was 72 years old. He had served as an ambassador, was a partner in a law firm, and had retired recently. And the boss said to me, "I just don't know why he'd want the job. He wants the job because he wants the job. He applied for the job because he wants the job. He has the skill set to do the job. What's the problem?" Could not get past the guy's age or the guy's experience. Never brought him in for an interview. This is a story that's as old as time now. And every company that passes up this opportunity is passing an opportunity to make big bucks. Now, there is the rise of the 50-plus entrepreneur across the world. But why are they doing it? Guess what? It's not because they got fired. Only 15% of people start a new company because they were let go. The vast majority of people, 42%, say they launched their business because they wanted to pursue their passion. 36%, the opportunity was there. I'm 1 and 2 and 3. 22% because they were unhappy working in corporate America. They wanted a break. They wanted something different. It's not because they get booted. It's not because they get booted. That is contrary to popular belief. People think that people start businesses out of necessity. They don't. They start it because they want to. Oftentimes, though, what we see in data across the board, it doesn't matter which geography, which nation, people aren't necessarily prepared to start a business on their own. But here's the good news. The average age of a successful entrepreneur is 45. That's the average age. There is a consistent trend of success as you go up in age. The highest risk, 20-somethings. Why are older adults less likely to fail? They have experience, years of experience that they can apply to their business. And while you may not see a lot of unicorns in this group of entrepreneurs, those billion-dollar companies, there are some. GoDaddy, which I imagine some of you have registered on your website before, that was an older worker who started GoDaddy. He's now living in a nursing home outside of Washington, D.C. I met him 2 weeks ago. Still a fascinating guy. But this is the future. So what can we do as a community to support this? Well, making sure that individuals who are interested in becoming entrepreneurs have the right skill sets, partnering with universities like Humber, colleges like Humber rather, to get the skills needed that they have to have in order to make their businesses even more successful. Because entrepreneurs not only build companies, they keep money in the community. They hire local people, and a lot of times they hire people that are just like them. Part of the reason we need to change our workforce is because all this demographic change that's happening isn't just impacting our workforce, it's also impacting our consumers. We have chased, since 1946, 18 to 34, the holy grail of the youth market. That is fading fast because there is roughly equal generational parity now amongst Boomer, Millennial, Gen Z, and Gen X. We also know that Boomers actually are still spending money, spending quite a bit of money. These are US dollars, apologies. Generation X spends the most because Generation X are in their prime working years. But Boomers, for the most part, are past their prime working years, at least according to the government at 65 plus, but they're still spending roughly on parity with Millennials. That's a big market there. But guess what? If you have a 20-something designing a product for a 65, 75, 85-year-old person, they're not going to get it right. You don't design for, you design with. And you do that by creating a multi-generational workforce. Now, we're already starting to see this show up in popular culture. People really grimace at that Martha cover every time. But we're starting to see that older adults are being represented in popular culture in a more positive way. Prior to about 10 years ago, older adults showing up on national magazine covers was next to rare. Older adults showing up as anything in television or radio or movies outside of a doting grandma or grandpa or somebody who is a little off was unusual. Now we see portrayals of active sex lives. Now we see leaders that are working into their 80s. Actors of stage and screen, entrepreneurs well into later life, all showing us what might be possible, aspirational. But what's cool about this is it's not just aspirational to older adults. I mean, people say, isn't that great? Like older adults are finally represented in television and movies and on magazines. It's awesome. But guess who this really impacts? These young guys back here. It really impacts them because it shows them a vision of what the future can be. Up until now, the vision of the future really had been 65 and done. Move to South Florida. Enjoy a few hurricanes. Have that life of leisure, retirement. That was all something new that we designed in the 20th century, really starting around 1965. This idea of going somewhere else, stopping, slowing down, but still living actively and engaged. It hasn't worked, and it's gone against human nature to stop. For all of human history, literally 10,000 years of recorded civilization that we know of. Obviously, we can't get back before that because we don't have the writings. 10,000 years of human civilization, people worked until they couldn't. That was just what it was. Old was a signal of no longer being able to work, not you're 65, you get your Medicare and your Social Security, or it's time for your state pension, or it's time for your gold watch. That's a man-made date. That's a man-made date, and it doesn't align with the realities of the time. And perhaps it never did. There have always been older people. I got news for you folks. There have always been older adults. Michelangelo, when he finished painting the Sistine Chapel, or when he died, painting the Sistine Chapel rather, was 88. He worked up until his last breath. That's normal. What's not normal is walking away from work. The thing we have to do across the board is shift focus away from what people can't do and immediately focus on what they can do. This helps break us of one of our biggest biases outside of ageism, which is ableism. We take a look at people, we see them using a device, we might feel like they're working a little bit slower than us, maybe not using the right language or the right technologies, and we think, they can't do it. It's not that they can't do it, they might not want to do it. Or maybe they don't necessarily want to learn, or maybe they don't want to necessarily ask for assistance. We can offer ways to help them and help individuals. We also have to break our ideas around age-based segmentation. This is a relatively new space. It's something that my organization and others have been exploring now for about 6 or 7 years, looking at stage segmentation over age segmentation. Because if you've seen one 65-year-old, you've seen one 65-year-old. It's a lot like an analogy of a tree. You know, if you put a tree in the ground as a seed, every seed looks exactly the same. But you take a look at a tree at 40 years, the two trees, they look wildly different. You take a look at them 80 years apart, they look even more different. It's the same with individuals. We aren't necessarily defined by our calendar year, and we shouldn't be defined by our calendar year, but we should be defined by where we are in our lives. So engaging with individuals starts with understanding the basics. Are you working? Are you retired? Do you own your home? Are you renting? And these are just a few ideas for you. Are you married? Dating? LGBT? Do you have kids at home? Kids out of home? Are you primary caregivers to your parents? Are you religious? Do you have a large group of friends? Or are you kind of lonely? Do you like analog tech or new tech? And are you healthy and active, or are you completely inactive? These help build a better picture of who the person is. So you might see that outward shell and say, oh, that person's old, oh, that person's young. Underneath that shell is all of this. So getting to understand this not only makes you a better manager, makes you a better colleague at work, a better employee, but it also helps you build better products and services because you're not working off of an archetype that might be outdated. We are in a vicious cycle right now. There's no doubt about it. A vicious cycle where we push people out of work at 65. When people leave work, their consumer behaviors fall off a cliff because they don't have disposable income. Their technology adaptation behaviors fall off a cliff because they're no longer using technology in their daily lives. They immediately start becoming sick. Men in particular. Women do better because you're much better at social life than we are. Starting with physical health, moving to mental health, also impacting cognitive health. These things put a huge strain on national welfare. And I'm not just talking about social welfare systems, I'm talking about the state. So moving to a virtuous cycle where we start to tap into this pool of older workers immediately starts to improve public health. So we'll lower the hospitalization and visits to the emergency room. We'll also see internally at our companies enhancing operations and innovation by engaging older workers for longer periods of time and creating these generational teams. The most exciting part for me is we get to create a whole new cohort of consumers. Whole new cohort of consumers means all this new innovation gets to be stimulated because we've never had this many people at this point in life alive ever before. So as excited as businesses got about the baby boom in 1946, they should be equally excited now that the baby boom is in retirement, or at least around retirement age, because there's this whole group of people that we've never really designed for before. We've thought, bugger off to the nursing home. Break it. We also have a unique opportunity and a must-need option to build the tax base and protect social welfare. We have spent over 100 years in our countries building these systems that allow the average person to live well into their 70s in the US and into their 80s in the US, in Canada and in Europe and in some parts of Asia. If we don't get this right, we will see that reverse. So I asked you the question, are you willing to give that up? I'm not. I think the future is incredibly bright. But I want you to remember these things as I close today. Ageism itself is bad for business. No one wins, young or old. Age itself is not a measure of ability or interest. And if you think it is, you've missed the plot. Age is just as much as a component of diversity, equity, and inclusion as anything else. It's different, but it has to be included in that practice. Inclusion stimulates innovation across the board. Remember, inclusive organizations that are doing it right outperform their competitors who do not by upwards of 30%. That is not a small number. Inclusive businesses are the way of the future, and they continue to outperform those that don't. On that, let's take some questions. Thank you very much.